On a cold March night in 59 AD, a boat sailed silently through the dark waters of the Gulf of Naples. On board was one of the most powerful women in the Roman Empire, Agrippina the Younger, mother of the Emperor Nero. The boat had been a gift from her son, supposedly a gesture of reconciliation after months of tension between them. As the boat moved away from the coast, a hidden mechanism was triggered. Suddenly, the cabin roof collapsed on Agrippina and her ladies-in-waiting. The boat began to sink exactly as planned. The dark waters of the Mediterranean slowly engulfed the vessel, but Agrippina, a remarkable swimmer, managed to escape and swam to shore. Soaked and exhausted, she realized the terrible truth. Her own son, the emperor she had placed on the throne, had tried to assassinate her. This failed attempt at matricide would be just the prelude to one of the most disturbing stories of ancient Rome. How did Rome's most infamous emperor come to the point of murdering his own mother? And how would the woman who built his empire end up the victim of his most monstrous creation? To understand this family tragedy that shook an empire, we need to go back to the beginning of this sinister relationship between mother and son. Agrippina the Younger, born in 15 AD, was no ordinary woman. Her blood was the noblest in Rome, granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, sister of Emperor Caligula, niece and fourth wife of Emperor Claudius, and mother of the future Emperor Nero. From her early years, Agrippina was shaped by a relentless environment of intrigue, murder, and absolute power. Her childhood was marked by tragedy. When she was just 13, her father, the popular Germanic general, died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned by order of Emperor Tiberius, who saw him as a threat. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, a woman of extraordinary courage, publicly accused the emperor of the murder. For this act of defiance, she and two of her sons were exiled to remote islands, where they starved to death. Young Agrippina learned early that in Rome, power was everything and that weakness meant death. When her brother Caligula became emperor in 37 AD, Agrippina briefly enjoyed prestige, but soon fell into disgrace, being exiled for allegedly participating in a conspiracy against him. Following Caligula's assassination in 41 AD, her uncle Claudius assumed the throne and allowed her return to Rome. Agrippina was then a 26-year-old widow, the mother of an only son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future Nero, born from her first marriage to Gnaeus. Domitius Ahenobarbus was a man so cruel that, according to historians, when congratulating friends on the birth of his son, he declared, "Agrippina and I could do nothing but something detestable and baneful to the public." Agrippina quickly married a wealthy senator, Gaius Sallustius Passienus Crispus, only to be widowed again. A few years later, she inherited his immense fortune. Armed with wealth and an illustrious name, she launched the most audacious plan in Roman history: to win over the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and make her son the heir to the empire. Claudius was already married to Messalina, a woman notorious for her scandals and infidelities. When Messalina finally overstepped the bounds by publicly marrying her lover while still the emperor's wife, Claudius had no choice but to order her execution. The way was open for Agrippina. Using her beauty and political savvy, Agrippina seduced her uncle, although such a union was considered incestuous by Roman law. The Senate, always eager to please the emperor, quickly changed the law, allowing marriage between uncle and niece. In 49 AD, Agrippina became Empress of Rome. But her true goal was never to become the emperor's wife. It was to make her son the next Caesar. Claudius already had a British son from his marriage to Messalina. For Agrippina, the boy was an obstacle that needed to be overcome. With manipulation and persistence, she convinced Claudius to adopt her son Lucius, who became known as Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Not satisfied with the adoption, Agrippina engineered the marriage of her 16-year-old son to Claudius's daughter Octavia, further solidifying her position. He finally succeeded in having Nero named as his successor instead of Britannicus. The historian Tacitus describes how Agrippina gradually isolated Britannicus, driving away his loyal slaves and replacing them with people under her control. The boy was effectively placed under house arrest while Nero was presented to the public and the legions as the future emperor. But Agrippina knew that as long as Claudius lived, her plans would remain vulnerable. The emperor was already showing signs of regret for having chosen Nero over his biological son. In October 54 AD, Claudius died after eating a dish of mushrooms. Roman historians are almost unanimous in stating that Agrippina poisoned him, probably with the help of a notorious poisoner named Locusta. Claudius was 63 years old and had reigned for 13. His last supper was carefully planned by his wife, who personally served the fatal dish. As the emperor lay dying, Agrippina kept her doors closed, spreading news that he was improving to buy time to secure the succession. Only when all arrangements had been made was Claudius's death announced. Nero, barely 17 years old, was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty Agrippina had bought with gold. The Senate quickly confirmed the succession, and thus began the reign of the man who would become one of the most infamous in Roman history. In the early years of his reign, Nero was essentially a puppet in the hands of his mother. Agrippina controlled audiences, dictated policy, and even participated in Senate meetings hidden behind a curtain. Coins were minted showing effigies of mother and son side by side, unprecedented in Roman history. When Armenian ambassadors came to pay homage, Agrippina prepared to sit next to Nero on the imperial throne, an outrage in Roman tradition. Only the intervention of the counselor Seneca averted this scandal when he discreetly suggested that Nero descend to receive his mother, thus preserving appearances. But the young emperor soon began to resent Agrippina's stifling control. His chief advisors, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, although initially supportive of Agrippina because of her appointment, began to encourage Nero to rule independently. They saw the empress mother's excessive influence as a danger to the stability of the empire. Nero's first significant rebellion against his mother came in the form of an affair with a former slave named Acte. When Agrippina angrily confronted him about this relationship unsuitable for an emperor, Nero responded by removing the official responsible for his mother's business, drastically reducing her income. More significantly, he ordered Agrippina to move from the imperial palace to a separate residence, symbolically diminishing her authority. Frustrated at losing control over her son, Agrippina made a fatal mistake. She threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's son, as the rightful heir to the throne. This threat sealed the young prince's fate. A few days later, during a banquet, Britannicus collapsed in convulsions after tasting his drink. As the horrified guests watched, Nero calmly reclined, explaining that the boy suffered from epilepsy. Britannicus was just 14 years old when he died. Clearly poisoned on Nero's orders, Agrippina, realizing the monstrosity she had created, began to back away. But it was too late. The battle between mother and son had already begun, and both had shown they would not hesitate at murder. For 3 years, their relationship deteriorated into a dangerous dance of veiled threats and false reconciliations. Agrippina still had powerful allies and knew secrets that could harm Nero. The emperor, for his part, grew increasingly annoyed with his mother's shadow. In 58 AD, Nero fell madly in love with Poppaea Sabina, wife of his friend Otho. Ambitious and cunning, Poppaea refused to be simply the emperor's mistress, insisting on marriage. There was, however, a problem. Nero was already married to Octavia, daughter of Claudius, a politically important match arranged by Agrippina. Poppaea knew that as long as Agrippina lived, Nero would never dare divorce Octavia. "You are not really emperor," Poppaea would have told Nero. Or would I not really be your wife? Why postpone our marriage? Could it be that Agrippina disapproves of your choices? If so, let the Roman people know that their emperor is still under the control of a woman. Prompted by Poppaea and increasingly paranoid, Nero finally decided that his mother needed to die. The problem was how to carry out such a crime without provoking public outrage. Murdering the daughter of Germanicus, a woman revered by the people and with powerful connections in the military. This was no simple task, even for an emperor. Nero consulted his closest advisors, the freedman Anicetus, commander of the Misenum fleet and Agrippina's personal enemy, suggested the plan of a ship that would dismantle itself at sea. Agrippina's death would make it appear as an accident, and Nero might even stage public mourning for his mother. The plan was accepted, and Nero personally took it upon himself to lure Agrippina into the trap. In March 59 AD, during the festival of Minerva at Baiae, Nero surprisingly showed affection for his mother, inviting her to a banquet of reconciliation. After the feast, he insisted that she return to his villa at Bauli on the special boat he had prepared for her. Delighted with the apparent renewal of filial love, Agrippina agreed. The failure of the first attempt left Nero in a panic. When he learned that his mother had survived, he summoned his advisors in an emergency. If Agrippina reported the assassination attempt, the Praetorian Guard might turn against him. Seneca and Burrus, although they had not participated in the initial plan, were now forced to support more drastic measures to protect the empire from the civil war that would surely follow if the truth came to light. Anicetus was sent with a detachment of sailors to complete what the sea had failed to do. By the time the assassins reached Agrippina's villa, she knew why they were coming. "If you are here to inquire of my health," she said with bitter irony, "report that I have recovered. If you have come to commit a crime, I do not believe my son ordered the parricide." Her last words, according to Tacitus, were directed at the centurion who drew his sword on her. Pointing to her belly, she cried, "Here is the womb that bore Nero." The assassins struck her multiple times and left her body where it fell. When news of Agrippina's death reached Nero, he personally came to view his mother's corpse. Surveying her naked body, he coldly commented on her physical flaws and merits before ordering a drink. The story, possibly apocryphal but revealing of the public perception of Nero, says he remarked, "I did not know I had such a beautiful mother." To justify the murder, Nero spread the word that Agrippina had plotted to kill him and, upon being discovered, had committed suicide. The ever-subservient Senate congratulated the emperor for escaping the maternal conspiracy. Only his aunt Domitia, who had hated Agrippina since childhood, refused to join in the general hypocrisy, remarking, "At last she got the son she deserved." The psychological consequences of matricide on Nero were devastating. Although publicly he seemed indifferent, privately he was tormented by nightmares and hallucinations. Suetonius reports that he frequently heard the sound of trumpets coming from his mother's tomb, and saw her ghostly form pursuing him with flaming whips. Seeking to escape these terrors, Nero temporarily left Rome by traveling through Campania. When he finally returned to the capital, he made a triumphant entry as if he had conquered an enemy and not murdered his mother. The matricide marked a turning point in Nero's reign. The first 5 years of his rule, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, had been relatively stable and well managed thanks to the moderating influence of Seneca and Burrus. Following Agrippina's death, the emperor's personality seemed to disintegrate. He abandoned the responsibilities of state to pursue increasingly extravagant and perverse pleasures. Free of his mother, Nero eventually divorced Octavia and married Poppaea. Octavia was initially banished and later executed, her head brought as a gift for Poppaea. This was only the beginning of a series of purges that would eliminate anyone remotely associated with Agrippina or considered a threat to Nero's power. The emperor plunged into unprecedented excesses. He spent fortunes on elaborate festivals, monumental constructions such as the Domus Aurea, Golden House, and expeditions to indulge his artistic fantasies. Considering himself a great musician, poet, and charioteer, Nero frequently appeared in public, forcing audiences to attend for hours while he sang or recited mediocre verse. Guards were posted to prevent spectators from leaving, and accounts mention men so desperate to escape that they feigned death to be led away. Seeking glory in art rather than arms, as would be expected of a Roman emperor, Nero organized the Neronia, Greek-style games celebrating music, gymnastics, and horse racing. To the horror of the Roman aristocracy, the emperor himself competed in these exhibitions and was invariably declared the victor. When he traveled to Greece in 67 AD, he participated in the Olympic Games where all his competitors wisely lost, including a chariot race in which Nero fell but was still declared the champion. In July 64 AD, a catastrophic fire destroyed much of Rome. Although Nero was anxious when the fire started, rumors quickly spread accusing him of setting fire to the city to clear space for his palace complex, the Domus Aurea. The legend that Nero played while Rome burned, though probably false, captures the public perception of his indifference to the suffering of others. Seeking a scapegoat for the fire, Nero blamed the small sect of Christians, initiating the first systematic persecution against them. Tacitus describes Christians being cooked in animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, crucified or transformed into human torches to light the imperial gardens during nocturnal feasts. Nero's financial excesses soon depleted the imperial treasury. To raise funds, he resorted to executions and confiscation of the property of wealthy citizens. Treason trials, virtually extinct during the early years of his reign, returned with renewed intensity. Anyone with substantial wealth could be accused of conspiring against the emperor, and their possessions reverted to the state upon execution. In 65 AD, a real conspiracy was uncovered. Led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, it involved senators and even officers of the Praetorian Guard. The repression was brutal. Dozens of prominent Romans were forced to commit suicide or executed, including the poet Lucan and Seneca himself, Nero's former tutor and advisor. 3 years later, Nero kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. He subsequently married the young Sporus, who resembled Poppaea, after ordering him to be castrated. On another occasion, Nero married his freedman Dorophorus, himself assuming the role of bride. Such behavior, shocking even by the lenient standards of the Roman elite, further alienated the emperor from the traditional classes. The provinces also suffered under the neglectful administration. Heavy tributes were exacted to finance Nero's projects, and corrupt governors, knowing the emperor was distracted, ruthlessly exploited their populations. In Judea, this oppression eventually contributed to the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 AD. In Britannia, Queen Boudica led a rebellion that nearly drove the Romans from the island. In March 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, openly revolted, describing Nero as a miserable artist and calling on other governors to join the rebellion. Although Vindex was defeated by the Germanic legions, his revolt inspired others. In April, Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself a supporter of the liberation of Rome from Nero's tyranny, although he carefully avoided declaring himself emperor. When news of these revolts reached Rome, Nero initially reacted with indifference, more concerned with his artistic interpretations. Only when he learned that other military commanders had joined Galba did he return to the capital in a panic. Grandiose and impractical plans were considered, including poisoning the entire Senate during a banquet or setting Rome on fire again. The situation rapidly deteriorated when Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, convinced the guard to abandon Nero by falsely promising a donation in Galba's name. The Senate, sensing that the emperor had lost his last military support, declared him a public enemy and condemned him to death in the old-fashioned way, being flogged to death while naked. On the night of June 9th, 68 AD, Nero fled Rome with only 4 loyal servants. Taking refuge in the villa of his freedman Phaon outside the city, the emperor, who had once ruled the known world, was hiding in a staff room debating his next step. When messengers brought news that soldiers were approaching to take him alive, he finally mustered the courage to commit suicide. His last words, "What artist dies with me?" perfectly capture his self-delusion to the very end. With the help of his secretary Epaphroditus, Nero plunged a dagger into his throat, dying at the age of 31 after a reign of nearly 14 years. His body was cremated without ceremony, and his ashes were later interred in the Domitia family mausoleum. The only people present at his funeral were his former lover, Acti, and 2 servants who had cared for him in childhood. Only they mourned the death of the man who had been the ruler of the Roman world. After Nero's death, Rome descended into the chaos of the Year of the 4 Emperors, a brutal civil war that nearly destroyed the empire. Only with the rise of Vespasian in 69 AD was stability restored. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae against Nero, the damnation of memory, ordering his statues to be destroyed and his name erased from public records. Ironically, the man who so desired to be immortalized through art was remembered primarily for his crimes. Nero became a symbol of tyranny, cruelty, and depravity, the antithesis of a good ruler. For early Christians, he was the very embodiment of the Antichrist, the number of the beast mentioned in Revelation. The story of Nero and Agrippina remains one of the darkest in ancient history. A family tragedy elevated to an imperial scale. Agrippina, in her relentless ambition to make her son emperor, created a monster that would eventually destroy her. Nero, deformed by absolute power and maternal manipulation, transformed into the tyrant his mother never imagined he would become. His matricide, the ultimate taboo even in morally flexible Roman society, marked not only his own damnation but symbolized the corruption of an entire imperial system that allowed such an aberration to rule the civilized world. As the historian Cassius Dio wrote, "He desecrated everything. He did not spare even his mother. There is no crime he did not commit." The life of the emperor who had his own mother killed remains one of the most disturbing studies of the corrosive effects of absolute power, unbridled ambition, and the moral collapse of the powerful. A narrative as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.